Good afternoon, everyone. Country Flyboy here, and today we're going to be talking aircraft CFG files. Now, I've been meaning to make this video for a long time, and I've struggled with how to make it. And I've decided that the best way would just be to explain them. So I have picked a default airplane. I've picked the default Cessna 208 Caravan. Give it a second to load here. And we're going to go through its CFG file, and we're going to talk about everything that I can think to mention with the aircraft CFG files. And there's a lot to go over. Now, I'm going to make a disclaimer real quick. I'm going to probably tick a few people off with this video because this video is going to be partly me explaining CFG files for your benefit so you can know how to modify them. The other one is going to be for me to vent and rant about certain developers who shall remain nameless, but a lot of developers get stuff wrong with this. There is no part of the CFG file that is... There's always something. No developer's perfect, and there's always something they screw up. But what ticks me off is the payware devs screw this up far more than they should. And there's plenty of examples of payware planes just not functioning where they should, and the solution is just changing one thing in the CFG file. And for a payware developer, for a developer that has the gall to charge money for an add-on for a flight sim, that is something they should be able to do very easily. We're talking designing an airplane 101 stuff here. And the other part of this video is going to be me making suggestions to both Dovetail and Lockheed of things that could be changed, the way the sim handles stuff, that could be changed or expanded upon in the future. Some of these could be really, really nice. So, before we get started, I want to talk about some of the tools you're going to need. And thankfully, some of these tools, actually, I don't think you're going to have to spend money on any of this. The first thing we're going to need is a way to edit the CFG files themselves. We can accomplish that with any text editor. I'm going to use Notepad++, and that's going to be my recommendation. But you can also use Notepad. You can also use WordPad. Those two programs come with any Windows computer. I recommend Notepad++. It's free, very good software. But again, Notepad, just regular Notepad, or WordPad will work just as well. The CFG files are basically text files in a fancy format. So the other thing we're going to need is the SDK documentation. Now, this came with Flight Sim X Deluxe Edition and was expanded upon in Acceleration. If you ever have a question about what a particular thing does, not just in aircraft design, but in any part of the sim, this is your first step. Now, I'm aware a lot of you, probably most of you, won't have this. There is an online version. I will link to an online version below in the description that is the ESP SDK, which is word for word the same. There's a few differences, but for the most part, it is the same as this. Now, everything I'm going to tell you came from this CFG file. It came from the CFG file, or it came from experiments I've done myself. So that is all 100% where you should look first. The other tool we're going to need is this one, which is AI Aircraft Editor. Free tool you can get from, I believe, Scruffy Duck, the same guy who made Airport Design Editor. They have this one. Now, this one allows you to edit some things of the CFG file, but the main reason we're going to use it is for this part of it. This is the 3D model viewer. You can click Model View here, and it will load up the 3D model. You can select textures. I've set the CFG file up so that only one texture is displayed, but you can look at it in texture mode, night render, but probably the mode you're going to use the most is wireframe. We're going to be using the wireframe mode quite a bit, as it is very useful for some of the stuff we're going to be doing. The other thing that is useful is this little plane icon here is Show CFG Points. And this allows you to toggle on or off these little colored squares that are the different CFG points of the airplane. They're color-coded, and each one means different things, but we'll go through them and show you what they all mean. For the most part, though, we'll be using wireframe, and we will need the CFG points. The last thing I can think you could need, aside from a calculator you might need every now and then, is the plane's POH, the POH of the airplane that you're working on, if you can get it. Either this or a training manual or an FCOM or something like that. Something that contains the information. The POH would be the best one, but I understand you might not be able to get a hold of this stuff. So here I've pulled up a POH for the Cessna 208B Caravan. This particular one is set for a G1000, but it's very similar to the default Caravan. And here you can see the different tables of contents that are in the POH. We'll be using the POH on and off throughout. Particularly, we're going to be referencing the general, the limitations, as well as the performance, weight and balance, and system description of the aircraft quite a bit. So now that we've talked about what you need, let's talk about the very, very first thing you should do whenever you edit an aircraft CFG file. You need to take the file, copy it, paste it, and then rename the original to aircraft_ORIG or original or backup or something. Now what that does is that allows you to make a backup. You're essentially copying the file and then renaming the original, so the original is your backup, and you always have that to revert. Very first thing you should do. Now you can see I've already done this here, so this is actually a copy of the CFG file that I made. That way your original is always your backup. This is important because if you ever need to copy it again in the future, say you want to make a slightly different version but keep your current edited version, then you don't have to make a copy of a copy. That not too big of a risk really, but it can lead to data corruption if you do it too much. So always back up the original first. That's the very, very first step the very first thing you should do. Alright, so let's talk a bit about the CFG file itself first. What is the CFG file? Well, to talk about the CFG file, we must first talk about another file, and that is this file right here, the AIR or air file. Now what the air file is, the air file contains the physics data for the plane. Every bit of physics data the sim needs to make the plane work is contained within the air file. That's all your more complex physics there. There's really not much you need to edit in the air file. As long as the air file was made by a competent developer, then it actually doesn't ever need to be touched. And you need certain programs to edit that file. There's a couple of free ones out there, but I don't normally mess with this particular one. There's really only one thing I ever have changed in an air file. We'll talk about that later. But the CFG file, in contrast to the air file, the CFG file contains the more generic, easier to edit data that the plane needs to know, that the sim needs to know in order for the plane to work. Variation data, some engine data, as well as weight and balance data, that is all in the CFG file. Now, one thing I want to mention about the CFG file is sometimes we may be defining the position of certain elements. So like right down here in the weight and balance, we define the station position of that particular weight and balance station. The position is always relative to a certain spot, and that is the datum reference point found right here. Now the datum reference point is basically where we define the datum reference point as a position that is offset from the flight sim reference position. If we look at our model editor, we can see the CFG file here says it's 1/4 chord, centerline, waterline. So we find the chord of the plane, which is the leading edge. I don't know if it's referring to the chord this way, centerline, waterline, vertical. It's 1/4 the plane's axes, basically. I don't know if chord refers to mean aeronautical chord or what it refers to, but it's 1/4 whatever. We want to define the datum reference position because all other data in the CFG file is relative to the datum reference position. Now you might be thinking, why is it done that way? Why is it not relative to the reference point or the model center point? Well, the reason is this thing right here. If we were to go down to the weight and balance section of the POH for this airplane, if we were to look at the weight and balance data for the airplane, you'll actually find that it's entered in the same way. Everything is relative to the datum. Now, what that means is we can define the datum in the sim as the exact same position as it's defined in the POH, which then means we can just copy the data from the POH with no fuss, no muss. That's all we got to do. That makes it very convenient, and that's why it's there, so you can easily copy that data over. Now, most of the time, you don't need to worry about this. The datum is set by the developer, and I usually do not recommend changing it, because when you change it, you automatically change the position of everything else. So it's usually best to leave this alone, and then just change the position of everything else as you need to. Okay, there's two more things to talk about, and that is disabling and one other thing I want to mention, and that is disabling it. You may notice these two right here. They have 2 forward slashes in front of them. And that is a good way to disable a particular line of the CFG file. If you want the sim to ignore any line of the CFG file, you can do so simply by putting 2 forward slashes in front of it, just like that. And that will disable that. Unfortunately, it will still be read by this thing, so it can get a little confusing. But that is a good way to disable any of that. And the last thing I want to talk about is implied defaults. Some of the stuff in the CFG file, like if we go down to the flight instruments section, or the instruments section, some stuff in the CFG file has a designated default. And if we look at, say, let's just look at attitude indicators to be simple. You notice there's 3 types supported: none, vacuum gyro, and electric gyro. Now, why would we need to define a none type? Wouldn't it just, if we don't put anything there, wouldn't it just assume there's no attitude indicator? Well, no. It actually sets some stuff up so that if you don't define it, it will assume a certain type. An attitude indicator is one of those. If you do not define an attitude indicator type, then it will default to a vacuum gyro. So if you need to define that an aircraft has no attitude indicator, you actually need to say that. And that applies for several things in the CFG file that we'll all talk about as we get down. Now, before we get started in the real meat of this, I want to first discuss that I'm not going to be going over absolutely everything, because some of it is deprecated, some of it doesn't work, and I don't know everything myself, although I do have the SDK to read up on, and I'm going to be showing you the stuff that you yourself can edit easily, or that something that publishers and developers have a constant hard time getting right. So without further ado, let's start talking about the actual data in the CFG file. Alright, so the first part of this is going to be talking about the 3 basic sections of the aircraft CFG file. This includes the flight sim in, or the version data, the general aircraft data, and the camera definitions. So starting with flight sim in, or version data, what this is certain editable parameters that allows you to have different versions of the aircraft contained within one folder. So if we go to the aircraft's folder, you can see we have one CFG file, one air file, one set of checklists, several textures, several folders for model, panel, sound. Now we can actually change all this up. We can have multiple model folders, we can have multiple panel folders, obviously multiple texture, and even sound, and even air files as well. This means that we can have multiple versions of the same aircraft within one folder. So let me show you like what Aerosoft likes to do with this F-16, where you just have several different folders with each version. No. You can actually change this up per airplane. And the main problem you run into is actually with weight and balance data, because you can only have one set of weight and balance data, but there are workarounds for this. So the Cessna 208 has multiple variants available. So let's say if we wanted to have these multiple variants. We have the regular variant, we can have one without a cargo pod, we could have a cargo version, or we could have the hybrid cargo passenger version. Then we can actually do that here. We can have one model for the regular, one model for the regular without the cargo pod, one model for the cargo version, and then another model for the hybrid version. We could share the panel between them all. They all have the same panel. The same sound folder will work. And we can give them different textures. And we can define that all here. Now the title, or I should say the number first, is which number. This has to be unique. Whenever you add a paint job to an airplane, what they usually want you to do is paste in this data. This is the data they're pasting in, and you replace the number with the next in sequence. So it goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all that fun stuff. You know, that's how you add a paint job. But what is contained within this data? The first part is the title, which is the aircraft's title, and it has to be unique. No two planes in the sim can have the same exact title. They have to be different to some extent. So don't get too crazy with this. You want it to be recognizable. You also want it to be relatively short and easy, because some programs will reference this as well. Certain object placers or other design tools like that will actually reference a particular aircraft title. So don't get too crazy with it. You typically want to go with how the airplane is known in real life, which will be make, model, variant. That's a pretty common one, and that's how the defaults work. So here's the default plane. We have the make, Cessna, the model, Grand Caravan, and the variant, Paint Job 1. That's pretty straightforward. Now these next ones, sim, model, panel, sound, texture, these are how you can change which files the texture, which one this variant references. Now obviously with this one, we only have one air file, which is Cessna208B.air. So if that's what we put that file name there without the .air, without the file extension. And you do the same for model, panel, sound, and texture. So let's say we had a different model. Let's say we had two model folders and one was with floats. We could name that model float, and then if we wanted one particular variant to specify the use of the float model, that's what we do. We type in that folder name, model, float. We type in, the model is implied, so we type in the name after the dot, the decimal, which is float. And that's how that works. And the same thing applies to panel, sound, texture, and everything else. That's how that works. And that is what allows you to have multiple variations of the same plane in one folder. Unfortunately, this is not something anyone makes use of. Now, these two here are the checklist and reference data. And this is by far the part that ticks me off the most, is because no developers ever use this. This is the checklist and the reference file. All the default airplanes come with one for the most part. Some of the acceleration planes won't, but most default planes come with this. And this is by far the area I wish developers would make use of more than they do, because this allows you to have a checklist and reference data in the sim via the pop-up kneeboard. Very, very useful, and it boggles my mind why developers don't do it, because these are just HTML files. Now, they don't support all features of HTML, but your basic formatting features like tables, bold text and stuff like that, all that is supported. Why more developers don't make use of that, I don't know. And of course here, just like with the stuff above it, you can specify which one of these to use. So you can have multiple checklist files for different aircraft variants. Now this next bit of data is the ATC data, and this is how ATC is going to recognize the airplane. The first one we have is ATC ID, which is pretty simple. That's the airplane's tail number. That's what goes there. The next one is ATC airline, which airline is what goes here. What airline does this plane fly for? And that is, this particular one flies for Landmark Airlines, which is one of the default airlines. What is its flight number? 1123. Of course, these four are changeable within the sim itself. The last one here, ATC Heavy, that's just a flag, either a 0 for no or 1 for yes. And that changes whether or not the aircraft is a type Heavy. So 747, that would be a 1, but for this Caravan, it's a 0. Now these last three you may not see because they don't appear on all of them. And what it is ATC Parking Type. This lets you specify what types of parking spots the aircraft can use. Now Flight Sim recognizes the following types of parking spots: either a ramp, cargo, gate, dock, military cargo, or military combat. So ramp is all your general aviation ramps. There's 4 subtypes of that, which is just regular ramp as well as small, medium, and large. There's the cargo type. There's the gate, and there's subtypes of small, medium, large gates. How does it know which one of the subtypes to use? That goes down into the aircraft reference data, which we'll talk about in a second. There's dock, which is for float planes. Unfortunately, no default airports make use of the dock type parking spot or military cargo or military combat, but you add-on sceneries can make use of it. And of course, mil combat, mil cargo. That's military stuff. So here you just list which one it was, and you separate them via comma, so ramp and gate. Make sure it's in all caps, though. Now, parking codes. This is the parking codes for a particular airline. Let's say this was for FedEx, and their code is FDX, if I remember. Now, ATC, whenever you are an AI plane using this paint job, requests taxi to parking, the ATC system is going to prioritize parking spots that also have this code. So that's how you can assign parking spots to certain airlines. It looks for a spot that matches what you specify here. That is very important if you're making AI planes, by the way. Make sure you get that right. Now, ATC model. This is actually an override. You specify this down here, but you can also specify it in a version, and it will override the one down here in the general section. So what this does is, this is what you put the aircraft's ICAO code. And the ATC system will recognize that ICAO code and call the aircraft by its type, Cessna Caravan in this instance. Now, the reason you can specify that here and override the one on the bottom is maybe there are different names for different subtypes. For example, the UH-60 series of helicopters, the UH-60 Blackhawk. Is it a UH-60 Blackhawk, an SH-60 Seahawk, or a AH-60 gunship variant of the Blackhawk, which I don't know if it has its own version name, but you get the idea. Now, this one here, you're not going to see that often because I'm not 100% sure if this works. I've only seen one airplane that makes use of this. And it's actually not even covered in the CFG file or the SDK either, and that is ATC ID color and ATC ID font and some font sizes, and that's pretty interesting. What that is referring to is the tail number. If I switch it over to textured right here, that appears. So default planes don't have any tail numbers baked into the texture like you find usually with ATC or with add-on textures for different planes. The reason they do that is so you can change this. You can change this up here. This will change what this says on default planes, but on add-on planes that have it baked into the texture, it won't. So this allows you to specify the font and color and font size that the N number will appear on planes that use this particular system. Why more add-on developers didn't use this, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't work. I've, again, only seen one plane that uses it, but it seems to work on that airplane. So here we specify the ATC ID color. Okay, that right there is UJML. That's the UJML code for a particular color. I found this nice little thing here. And these are all the predefined colors right here, but you can also customize the colors. This particular code is for the black color. So this is saying the ATC ID tail number is going to show up as black. The font it wants you to use is Arial. Now the sizes, I'm not 100% sure because there's 4 numbers mentioned here. Just looking at it, I would assume this is height, and then this is length. That's what I would assume. or it doesn't seem that position data is stored here, because it seems that the position is controlled by the model itself. So I'm not 100% sure, so I'm just going to skip that, but do know it is possible to customize that so that it has a particular color and a font. And now this bit here, this is all UI data. Firstly, we have UI manufacturer. Now, this is for the aircraft's manufacturer. So many people put the developer of the actual add-on plane for flight sim here. Please don't do that. Put the manufacturer of the airplane. Cessna, Beechcraft, Boeing, Airbus, whoever made it, that's what goes here. The reason you want to do that is because this allows you to sort the aircraft in the sim a lot better. If you have a lot of airplanes and you want to find a particular Cessna, you can find it using the sort features, but unfortunately, far too many developers put the wrong data here. This is for the manufacturer of the plane, not the developer of the add-on. The developer of the add-on goes down here with created by. All right. So UI type, you can put the aircraft's ICAO code here, C208B Grand Caravan, something like that. UI variation, just list a short description of the variant. Say this one is white, red, and black because it's only varying the paint job. But back to our helicopter example, you could say this is the UH-60 Blackhawk, this is the SH-60 gunship, or no, the SH-60 Seahawk, and the AH-60 gunship. You can have that. The type role, single engine prop. Let me look at the SDK, see what it supports here. It might, let's see, UI type role. Yeah, you can put anything here to specify the type of the aircraft. This is a single engine turboprop. Beechcraft King Air would be a twin engine turboprop. AH-60 would be a gunship variant of the UH-60 helicopter. And here, UI created by. This is where you put your name, developers. That way we can find stuff properly. Far too many developers get this and this mixed up. Please stop doing that. And lastly, we have aircraft description. This is a brief description of the aircraft. You can put whatever here. Keep it short, simple, and to the point, though. Now, these last two I've disabled. And the first one, line 27, is prop animation ratio. What it is the ratio of rotor revolutions rendered to the actual revolutions in the simulator. It seems to be done, or the example it gives is the 206 Jet Ranger, which is 1.76. I don't know exactly what that does, but that seems to have something to do with the prop spinning effect. And lastly, visual damage. Visual damage, this is a flag. You can either turn visual damage off or visual damage on. Believe it or not, the ESP-based flight sims have supported visual damage, i.e. wings falling off the plane when you hit something, for a long time, going back to FS 2002, I think. Unfortunately, very, very few developers use this. In fact, so few, I know of only one plane that you can't even get anymore that has ever used it for FSX. Now, don't go thinking you can flip this to a 1 and all of a sudden the planes will start bursting into flames in your sim. It doesn't work that way. See, the reason this is not supported or not done too much is because this also has to be programmed into the 3D model. You actually have to make the 3D model without, if you want the wing to fall off, for example, if you hit something, you have to make the wing of the model be able to disappear properly and attach it to the visual damage stuff. And this here lets you turn that on or off. It's unfortunate more developers don't make use of this because it is kind of cool to see it. Now this next one is pretty simple. It's just general aircraft data. We have ATC Type, which is the aircraft manufacturer, again, Cessna. We also have ATC Model. Editable, this is, I don't really know. This, even in the SDK, it actually says this is not supported. It does nothing. It's a flag. It almost always says 0, or sometimes it says 1, but it doesn't seem to do anything. Now, performance, this is a bit confusing, but this is basically performance data that is just for UI and flight planner purposes. The default flight planner will actually make use of this data here some of it anyway, particularly speed and I think fuel consumption as well. So this is mostly for UI. When you select the plane, this stuff will pop up. And lastly, category. We have a few categories supported. Only 3 actually. Either airplane or helicopter. And I think you can put none here as well. 9 times out of 10 it's going to be airplane. But if it's an airplane, put airplane. If it's a helicopter, put helicopter. If it's a car or a ship or something, I guess you put none. So there you go. Now the camera definition, I don't want to spend too much time on. I don't normally change this stuff. It seems to be best left to the developers. But to go through it, it's pretty similar to the Flight Sim N stuff here. Camera definition, .0, go in order. Title, what do you want this one to be called? Guide, I don't know what that references. It references the GUID or guide number, obviously. But that's usually for scenery objects, so I don't know what it's referencing here. Something to do with something. I have no clue. Description, this is a short description of the view. In this case, view of landing gear, look and left wing inboard flaps. The origin, now this changes depending on where you want that to be relative to. And you have 2 options. You can put center, which is for external, relative to the center of the point of the plane. Or you can put, what was the last one? Virtual cockpit, if you want it to be an interior one. Now we have a couple of snap and pan adjustments here. Snap, pan, adjust. I don't know what PBH stands for. Let's see if the SDK tell us. Nope, doesn't give us a definition of anything. But you can basically turn snapping adjust off, or snap adjust type, swivel. What goes here? Either swivel or none. So you can, I guess that tells you whether or not you can move the camera around. Is it snap type? Is it panning? I don't really know. Track, what does track actually do? It doesn't actually give us an example, sadly. They always say none. I wonder if that is supposed to be tied to a more complex video system, because there are key commands for beginning and stopping recording videos built into the sim. So that might be something like that, a la demo records for like Star Trek Online or something like that, when I used to play that. Show axis, turns on the axis or not. This is all pretty straightforward stuff, so I think it's best just to leave this alone. I almost never touch this. It's usually best just to leave it alone anyway. So we're going to skip past this and go right to the next one. It goes, holy wow, that's a crosswind. Holy cow. I wonder if I could pit maneuver you.
I'm running on